I grew up in Canada, and so Europe was something that some of us had come from. My mother, for example, came from the United Kingdom, and there were immigrants coming from Europe throughout my childhood, and of course throughout my lifetime. And Europe was a place where a lot of ideas had come from. We knew we were different, but we also felt that we had a certain attachment to Europe. But it was something that, for very much for Canadians, and I think it's still true today, included the United Kingdom, the British Isles. You know, when we talked in Canada, as we did, about going to Europe, we included in Europe the British Isles. And so for us, Britain was something that some of us might have had a particular attachment to, but not something that was different from Europe. Well, I was born in 1943 at the end of the Second World War, and so as I began to become conscious, it was the late 1940s, early 1950s. And so the story of Europe was a complicated one. It was a place that had produced dreadful wars. It was a place that had produced the Holocaust. It was a place also, however, that had produced many great ideas that had shaped our society. And so I think we had a complicated relationship with Europe. And to us, certainly in the 1950s, it was a place that was very badly battered by war. I think a lot of people thought, probably our parents thought, that Europe would never really recover. I think, you know, we were all, I think, quite surprised at the tremendous recovery of Europe and the very fast recovery of Europe. It was mixed feelings. I think we recognized that Europe had, through its national rivalries, its economic rivalries, its military rivalries, its arms race, produced two world wars. And it was a very troubled continent. It remained, of course, a troubled continent because of the Cold War, divided right down the middle. But I think a lot of Canadians thought that the more multinational organizations, the better. I mean, Canadians have always been great supporters of multilateralism and multinational organization. And I think we saw the European Union, initially, of course, the European Economic Community and then the European Common Market, as something that would help to overcome some of the deep divisions in Europe. But as I say, we had mixed feelings because a successful Europe, or a successful European Economic Community with tariff barriers, was not going to be good for Canadian agriculture and Canadian exports. And I think there was something of a shock in Canada when the British suddenly decided in the 1970s that they wanted to apply, join the Common Market. They didn't say much to us, they didn't say much to the Australians, they didn't say much to the New Zealanders by way of warning. And I think there was a certain amount of resentment that the British were very good at talking about the empire and talking about the ties of the Commonwealth, but when it suited them, they paid no attention to it whatsoever. That's an interesting question. I think perceptions always change, and I think I've become aware of the great success of the European project, which of course is much more than the European Union. And I think that's important to remember. I mean, I think what helps to keep Europe together are shared values. And as an historian, and I've found myself increasingly going back in history, I've been looking more and more at periods like the classical period, or the Middle Ages. And it seems to me that there have always been, for far back as pretty much as we know, ties throughout the Eurasian landmass, and particularly this western bit of the Eurasian landmass. There have been ties of trade, ties of conquest, ties of movements of people, ties of movements of language and culture. And so I think I've become much more aware of the things that really Europe has in common than the things that divide it. Well, I think that's true of much of history. I mean, we all have our own narratives of the past. Some, I think, are more authentic than others. Some are not based on evidence at all, some are wishful thinking, some are a willful or, I think, sometimes ignorant misreading of history back into the past. And so you'll get people saying today, well, there's a German nation today, there's a British nation today, or an English nation today. There must always have been one. And of course that, I think, is a very bad sort of history. But I think I've become aware that narratives are very important. There are ways in which people mobilize themselves, there are ways in which people define themselves. Narratives are a way in which people develop a sense of nationhood, but perhaps also a sense of grievance or a sense of the goals they might want to achieve. And I think the dangerous thing in narratives can be when they exclude others, or when they portray others in an unfavorable light, because they tend to give, the danger of a narrative, I think, is it tends to give the impression that it's moving inexorably to a particular end, that it's a story that is unfolding. And I think that's where we really have to be careful. And the phrase, I think, multiple narratives is an important one, that there are different ways of looking at the past. You could write a history of the past through a narrative of women. You could write a history of the past through a narrative of the working class. And people have. You could write a history of the past through the narrative of particular religious movements. And I think the best histories are the ones which try and understand, accept, explain, and use those narratives. But to me, as an historian, what's always important is the evidence.